In this video, we're going to discuss additional civil rights amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Now, these amendments were added after the Bill of Rights. Now, remember, the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791, and that meant that it only applied to a select group of people, white male property owners. What we are going to see now is the additional amendments that are going to be applied to women and people of color. So, let's take a look at the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, the same year the Civil War ended. What this amendment to the Constitution did was it abolished slavery. You couldn't force somebody to work for free anymore unless it was the penalty for a criminal conviction. You can force a prisoner to work, but you can't force any free man to work. That became illegal as of 1865. 3 years later, in 1868, we had the 14th Amendment. Now, if you see here, the 14th Amendment gave citizenship to all former slaves, because the 14th Amendment says that if you're born here, you're a citizen here, and all the slaves at that time had been born in the United States, so thus they were given the right of citizenship. 2 years later, we saw the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870. This amendment granted something known as suffrage, which is the right to vote, to former male slaves. Women still did not have the right to vote. So this is what I want you to take in mind. Whenever you're taking a test or you're thinking about, dates, you don't need to memorize dates. You need to know time periods. And if you look at these three amendments, the 13th was 1865, the 14th was 1868, and the 15th was 1870. So those all have to deal with slavery and post-slavery, and they're all in the mid-1800s. So if you see anything mid-1800s, you're either talking about pre-slavery or during slavery, or post-slavery, okay? Moving on. About 31 years after the slaves had been freed, there was a Supreme Court case, and that case was known as Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, this court case was ruled on by the Supreme Court of the United States in 1896, and what it ruled was this. It said blacks and whites are equal under the law, but we're not equal in social terms. Therefore, we had the advent or the beginning of what became known as the Jim Crow laws, segregation, separation of the races. This is where you would see those signs, whites only, coloreds only, at places like restaurants, theaters, water fountains, schools, bathrooms, any place out in public. You could separate the races because the Supreme Court, under the ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, made it completely legal. So Jim Crow basically allowed for segregation or separation of the races, and you'll notice that this is still in the 1800s. Now, I'm going to go back to 1870. Now, 1870 was when former male slaves were granted suffrage, but that's also the year that the women's suffrage movement began. Women began to think that if a male slave was given the right to vote, why shouldn't women be given the right to vote? That's when they began campaigning for suffrage, and it took them nearly 50 years to get the right to vote. And here's the easiest way to remember when women got the right to vote. The 19th Amendment gave women suffrage, and it was passed in 1919. So now, every U.S. citizen of age could vote in a national election. Now, that being said, We're going to see certain areas of the country, primarily the American South, they're going to try to find ways around giving voting rights to people of color. Now, if you remember, the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights said that states could make their own laws so long as they didn't violate the Constitution. Well, certain states took advantage of this, and they passed their own laws for their own states that would restrict people of color from voting. They would require literacy tests. Now, that's just like it sounds. It's a test of whether or not you can read, but they knew what they were doing, because at that time, there were a majority of people of color who were uneducated or illiterate, and thus were unable to pass the test. And even if they could read, they were often given hard text with hard questions, and thus were unable to pass, and thus unable to vote. Another way they tried to restrict people of color from voting were poll taxes. Now, this meant you had to pay to vote. But, well, everybody had to pay to vote. It didn't matter if you were black, white, yellow, green, whatever. But they knew what they were doing once again, because they knew that more white people had the ability to pay than black people did. So thus, they would be able to restrict people of color from voting. Now we're going to move on up to the 1960s. Now, this is the era of the civil rights movement. Now, what I would like for everybody to do after we've gone through this video is I would like for you to click on the little tab that says Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail and read what Dr. King wrote. He's writing about how blacks were treated down in Birmingham, Alabama, how it was the most violent and racist city ever, and how he's calling his leaders to action to stand up to the white oppressors. Okay? After you've read that, what I would like for you to do is see if you can figure out what that underlined word means. Okay? You'll see it. Now, Martin Luther King and the many other civil rights activists made a lot of gains in the 60s. Because of their work, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, and it banned discrimination in public. This is why whenever you go to a public place, you often see signs that say, "We do not discriminate based on the basis of color, race, sex, gender, creed, religion." They're required to display that, and that is because of the Civil Rights Act. Public discrimination is now illegal as of 1964. That same year, the 24th Amendment was passed by Congress, and that banned poll taxes. So now you no longer had to pay to vote. In 1965, literacy tests were banned. So this is what I would like for you to consider, okay? In 1870, that is when the former slaves, or at least the former male slaves, were given the right to vote. However, it wasn't until 1965 that they enjoyed it fully, okay? That's nearly 100 years after being given the right of suffrage that they finally were able to embrace and enjoy it. Thank you.